Hello, Matt. Thank you so much for joining the Internal Communication Spotlight series that I run on my blog. And I've been talking to a lot of thought leaders on the way internal communications influences organizations and how practitioners and academicians think about the domain. So I've spoken to people about executive presence, leadership, culture, change, and I'm delighted to have you speak about crisis communication reputation. So before we get started, it'll be great if you could quickly introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. Happy to do that. And thank you again for having me, Anissa. My name is Matt Tidwell. I am an assistant dean at the University of Kansas in the U.S. I'm in our School of Journalism and Mass Communications and have been for about the last 3 years since getting my Ph.D. Prior to that, I spent, 25 years in the profession. So working in a number of large industries, energy, pharmaceutical. I worked for a time for a global pharmaceutical firm in the manufacturing side. I worked for a couple of marketing communications agencies in the Midwestern part of the United States for, again, about 4 or 5 years. So sort of a winding career through corporate communications and marketing, culminating with a PhD a few years ago, just because I went back and got my own master's degree late in life and got bitten by the teaching bug, as many of us have. And so
Right.
I've landed in academia, but very glad that I have. Really enjoy it. Enjoy working with students. I also teach. I teach crisis communications and
Mhm.
also relationship marketing at the graduate level to master's degree students typically. Also occasionally to PhD students as well. So so that's my story.
Fantastic. And I know that you're also closely involved with the IBC. And you mentioned that you did your thesis on crisis communication and reputation. So I'm curious to know, what are some of the issues organizations grapple with when it comes to crisis management?
Yeah, I think there are two primarily that I see. One is a lack of preparedness, and you would think in this day and age that we would see organizations be completely crisis prepared, but of course, many times that's not the case. And even frankly, for some larger organizations that I can think of, sadly, I'm not sure what we've often grappled with why that is. Whether it's just the organizational will and commitment, whether it is sort of the bury your head in the sand mentality that certainly is a phenomenon. Again, we would think that that would be less, but we still see it. So I think lack of preparedness would be the first one. And the second one that I would say is poor alignment and many times poor organization.
Mhm.
Or the ownership for crisis communications might not necessarily rest in the communications department, strangely. Oftentimes we see it in other areas, which of course is an example of poor organization. And I say poor alignment because a lot of times, particularly in the last 20 years, as you know, ever
Mhm.
since Jim Collins graced us with Good to Great, the book,
Right.
organizations have been very focused on their core purpose and on their values. And so many of them, in
Right.
fact, went to great lengths to develop
Yeah.
values programs. But oftentimes, and I've studied this, you see poor alignment between an organization's stated values and their crisis communications planning. You would think those
Mhm.
two would be very closely attached. Many
Right.
times they aren't. And so I think that there are definitely organizational alignment issues that also plague many organizations in this field.
Great. And so what is your understanding? How important is internal communications when it comes to managing crises? And what is the role of organizations when they, in terms of taking employees along the journey of solving or managing a crisis?
Such a great question because it absolutely has vaulted into much more prominence than it was certainly when I broke into the business 25 years ago, a little more than that now. Employees have risen steadily up the stakeholder ranking. It used to be that employees were somewhere, down. They were almost an afterthought, frankly, in many organizations. And particularly if you look back in the '60s and '70s, kind of the Mad Men era, as we say here. Now, what we're seeing is that they've become many organizations do recognize this, I think. They've invested in proper internal communications. And so employees have not only a large stake in the organization, but they have a large role to play when we are facing issues and crises. No question about it. And, I can remember working for a large energy company in my organization or in my community. And we went through a situation where we raised our customer rates that they were paying for their electricity 3 times in the span of about 3 years. And so, that was an issue for us to manage. Didn't always rise to a crisis, but certainly was an issue. And so we relied heavily on our employees to be out as ambassadors in the community to explain why we were taking these actions. The community was growing. We needed to invest. We were building our downtown. And so that took lots of infrastructure and electricity and investment, which was good for the community. But of course, that has a cost as well. And so it was important for us to educate employees as to why we were taking those actions. And so I think any good organization would absolutely bring their employees into the tent and have them help with issues in crisis management communications whenever they can.
Got it. Got it. And what, according to you, what is the impact and the value of crisis communication when it comes to the organization's brand and reputation? So what do you think goes into that?
Yeah, value is huge. I think frankly, a crisis can make or break an organization's reputation. Again, much more so than we saw decades ago. I think that we know that organizations, companies, nonprofits are under much more scrutiny than they were decades ago. The stakeholders, frankly, are more demanding and demand things like transparency and just a high degree of just transparency and communications from their organizations. I mentioned the energy company, good example, right? If you're in the community, you want for your energy company to communicate with you as to why they're doing what they do. So, and if you don't do that, then your reputation will suffer, and we see that. There are really good reputational tools out there, Rep Tracker, Harris, and others that track organizations. And this is another area where I've done some research into taking a look at when a crisis befalls an organization, what does that do to their reputational rankings? Now, of course, we see a dip. Oftentimes we think that there will be a rebound if the organization does a good job. And we do see that rebound. But what's interesting is it's taking longer for organizations. I think you and I have talked about this. It's taking longer for organizations to recover when you look at those reputation rankings over time. It used to be the recovery curve would begin fairly quickly. Now there's a much longer, steep, almost more of a leveled curve to retain or to achieve the level of reputation that maybe they had prior to the crisis. And so I think that should be a message to all organizations that they need to take crisis communication, transparency, things like that very seriously, or it will have huge implications for their reputation.
And that's an interesting segue, because I wanted to kind of talk to you about, what is the, how, when you talk about recovery and rebounding, what is the role of crisis communications in that, and how do you see that working in the organizations?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think as marketing communicators, we have a huge role. I think we should be very much out front with leadership at the organization to make sure they understand the implications of not being prepared. And so I think that that's a key role for marketing communicators. And that's why at all of the major organizations, as you mentioned, I'm on the board for IABC, but there are several in Europe, and we have PRSA here in the US. I think what you're seeing is, I know when I get program for upcoming conferences, the number of presentations around crises are much more than what they were a few years ago, because everyone is getting that message that as communicators, we need to be the ones banging the drum for effective preparedness. And so not only advocating for it, but of course, using our tools as communicators to then fashion the appropriate plans, develop the appropriate practice, frankly, that we need in large organizations to make sure that our skills are sharp in this area. So yeah, communicators, marketing communicators have a huge role, no question about it.
Brilliant. Yeah. And now we are in the midst of a pandemic, and organizations obviously trying to cope with what's happening. So what do you think is the role of the communicator to kind of shape the organization's narrative? I mean, how does that pan out?
Yeah, and we've seen that during the pandemic. I think what the pandemic has done is all of those good practices that we've talked about. transparency, making sure that your expertise is out front and on display as an organization. Those have all just been magnified
Mm.
and than what they were pre-pandemic. And frankly, I think that we've now trained our stakeholders to get lots of information from us in a time like
Mm.
this. And I believe that we've trained them and now there's no going back, right? So when we're
Yeah.
in post-pandemic, the
Yeah.
demand for stakeholders for transparent information, for timely information,
Right.
is will continue, and
Mm.
so there's no turning back, as they say. So I think the pandemic has magnified what
Mm.
we do and the importance of what we do, and then I would say that it will have long-term effects
Mm.
because we will have to keep up those good practices after the pandemic because again, there's no going back.
Got it. And related to that, there have been great cases of leaders and managers stepping up and trying to manage through crises. But what's your advice, or what do you recommend leaders should do more to take control of a crisis?
Yeah, had some good examples during the pandemic, right? I share with my classes. Unfortunately, we just lost this gentleman because he was a fantastic CEO.
Right.
But the CEO of Marriott is a gentleman by the name of Arnie Sorensen,
Right.
and he within, I believe this was 48 hours of the day, a couple of days ago, what the anniversary last year,
Mm.
he was out with about a 5-minute video to all employees that was very straight and to the point. Here's what's
Mm.
happening. Here's what the implications will be. The executive team is taking a pay cut effective today. We have closed these properties around the world as we retrofit for cleanliness and disinfecting and things like that. He had
Mm.
a very specific action plan that was communicated almost immediately,
Right.
and it struck me. And the point that I make to students is this is good leadership in a crisis, explaining
Right.
the actions that you're taking clearly, but also very quickly to get out in front of, as we all know, the
Mm.
one nemesis of crisis communications is the rumor mill. And I think
Right.
leaders can do, much like Mr. Sorensen, can do a great job of disarming that rumor mill by being out front very quickly. And again, I would say I recommend to leaders that I talk with, particularly if you're in a high visibility organization like, say, a Marriott, that yes,
Mm.
24 to 48 hours, you have to be out with your message of what your action plan is. And so I think good leaders have done that in pandemic, but we've seen, I certainly have talked to employees and people like that at other organizations where the information wasn't quite as free flowing, really
Mm.
not only in the beginning, but throughout the crisis.
Yeah.
And so all that leads to is more uncertainty, more ginning up of the rumor mill, none of which is good for us as communicators, as we all know.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. And as we wrap up, Matt, just want to ask you, what's your advice for communicators, in terms of how they should be thinking about the organizational reputation?
Yeah, sure. What I would say is if your organization, and most do, have a well-developed values program, insist on that alignment, right?
Mm.
If our values are things like, honesty and transparency, and again, let's not make those just nice plaques that we hang up on the conference room
Right.
wall. As communicators, let's insist that those values play a role in our communications.
Right.
And because I think what happens is many times they are just plaques on the wall. We
Right.
don't put any real operational strength behind them,
Mm.
and so that ends up being very visible to our stakeholders, and we're not really walking the talk.
Right.
And so I think that as communicators, particularly as you move to more leadership roles, now again,
Mm.
if you're an entry level communicator, I understand this can be hard to do, but
Right.
for many, for instance, of our members at IABC and PRSA and others that I deal with, we talk about that factor of insisting that your values be something that live and breathe and have a role in your communications operations. So that would be my advice.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Matt, for taking time to do this. I'm sure these are extremely valuable insights which our viewers will gain from. So thank you again for taking the time.
You're welcome. Thank you, Anisu, and thank you for having this series because I know it's valuable to lots of folks. I appreciate you doing it.